this week our number that moves the world is the Consumer Price Index. So to introduce the Consumer Price Index, I just want to start with this chart. So this relates to a fun personal anecdote. So when I lived in California, I had a neighbor who pleasant, neat couple. They spent most of their time overseas with the Foreign Service, and their most recent assignment was in Zimbabwe. And as I was talking to them, I mentioned that it would be so amazing to have a 1 billion Zimbabwe dollar note, and she went and grabbed one for me. So the reason that was kind of an in-the-know question to ask, right, is that Zimbabwe experienced terrible hyperinflation, and so what we're looking at here is the actual exchange rate between the Zimbabwe dollar and the U.S. dollar. And right, it's pretty clear that this is a pretty steep hockey stick, right? It starts relatively flat and then zooms up in the extreme at the very end. So this obviously indicates that there were a whole lot more Zimbabwe dollars per dollar in 2009 than there were in 2001. But what is really striking about this chart is if you actually go over and look at the scale. So this chart is actually in a log scale. So every line, right, every tick mark on that y-axis represents an increase by a factor of 10. So every time it moves up one tick, it's decreasing in value by 10 times, not by that small amount. And so there are lots of things that make sense to look at in logs, right? In particular, right, we looked at GDP using log plots, and the United States GDP per capita is very linear in log, right? Because it grows at a fairly constant rate. And you can see that this is not linear in log. This is hockey stick in log, which means the Zimbabwe inflation was so unbelievably huge and fast that it looks like an explosion in a log scale, right? This is 10 to the 30th up at the top there. That's a 1 with 30 zeros. So there's a reason this graph ends. At this point, it became unsustainable to even use the currency. So much money was being spent trying to print banknotes to keep up with the ever increasing demand for zeros that it didn't even make sense to keep printing. And for the most part, the locals, or people who lived through this experience, quit using the currency for anything meaningful, and so they found other things. Typically currencies from other countries, and in fact, by 2015, the Zimbabwe, the nation, abandoned their currency altogether, and so basically people weren't using it, and so even with the force of the state behind it, it wasn't enough to get people to actually use it, and so they recognized that it had failed and moved on to other things. So the reason that's relevant, of course, if we're talking about a consumer price index, well, if the Zimbabwe dollar is exploding relative to the price of U.S. dollars, we know, thinking about exports and imports, that anything that local citizens are trying to import are going to look incredibly expensive and increasingly expensive every minute of every day with this kind of inflation. And so that, of course, can create a lot of havoc for local economies, and a lot of pain and misery for consumers, and also some weird situations. So, for example, if in a hyperinflationary scenario like this, you could imagine a situation where let's imagine that the postal worker is in charge of collecting the phone bill. So your mailman comes around and collects your monthly phone bills, and that this is a significant part of their work day or work month. And with inflation like this and hyperinflationary regimes, it can actually make more sense for the postal worker to stay home, take the day off, and by the time he actually has to turn in the money that he'd collected, it would be just easier to pay it out of pocket, because it would be at that point not very much money at all. And then this is a true occurrence that actually happened. So again, so inflation at this scale is not historically unprecedented, right? There are a couple. There's lots of examples we can point to, and maybe not quite this extreme, but inflation, currencies whose inflation was bad enough that they were abandoned. So Hungary had the pengo that for only about a 20-year period that was abandoned for a different currency, partly because of inflation. And so because price changes and rapid price changes have such a serious effect on the everyday life experience of consumers in a country, the Consumer Price Index, which tracks a basket of goods and services bought in that country, becomes a really important indicator of people's experience. So just to contrast that, so here we have the Zimbabwe US dollar exchange rate. So to contrast that, we have here the story of Coca-Cola in the United States. So from 1886 to 1959, so a period of, what is that, almost over 70 years, Coca-Cola cost 5 cents across the country, and so there's a combination of factors of that, but a major contributing factor to 5% Coke was that over this period, the United States had much lower inflation than we experience today, and the inflation in the United States is not particularly large right now, but over that period, it was even less. And towards the end of this period, the Coca-Cola company was concerned that it would be able to maintain the 5 cent price target. It was becoming economically unfeasible. But they were also worried that at one point, the Coca-Cola company owned 80% of the vending machines in the United States. And at the time, the machines had trouble making change, and they were worried people would be confused by having to pay multiple coins to buy a pop. And so they actually lobbied the federal government, the mint, to issue a 7.5 cent coin. They were asking for a 7.5 cent coin so that people could still pay 1 coin to get their Coca-Cola. It would just be a 7.5 cent coin instead of a 5 cent coin. That didn't work. The mint didn't agree to print a 7.5 cent coin, and 10 cents is too much of a price jump for 5 cents. And so the notion of 1 coin for 1 cola went by the wayside right around 1959, 1960. And not too soon after that, vending machines became technologically capable of making change, and so it became a non-issue. But these are very different experiences for consumers in these two different countries. Right, in Zimbabwe, you would see prices changing, hourly or daily, very, very, very frequently. Whereas in the United States, we could, this is an extreme example. Right? Most prices didn't stay this stable, but we had a long period of relatively stable prices. So, what causes these differences? Well, we can get into that. But the first thing we need to talk about is how we measure that. So, in modern society, the way we typically measure inflation is using the consumer price index, which we'll get into the definition of. There's some fun alternatives though before we launch into it. So the Big Mac index is a good one. It tracks how much does a Big Mac cost in lots of different countries, and again that makes it less accurate because it's only one product, but that tends to be fairly representative because it's an agricultural product with lots of different ingredients that requires a lot of labor, right? It's hot food, and so it's kind of touches in lots of different things, and so it's a little tongue-in-cheek, but it's fun to then go and see, right? There's a human element to it. If I go look and say, oh wow, a Big Mac in Switzerland is $9 or $11, that says something to me about what it's like to live in countries that have higher expenses. So let's get into the definition of the Consumer Price Index. For this brief discussion, I'm taking some material available from the Federal Reserve on the topic. So this is the Federal Reserve of St. Louis this time. So first of all, the consumer price, the data in the Consumer Price Index is collected by the Bureau of Labor Statistics. The Bureau of Labor Statistics has a ton of data freely available. It's really useful. I've used the Bureau of Labor Statistics in work in lots of areas, but at Viterbo in particular, we were looking at doing a salary benchmarking exercise for employees of Viterbo, and so it made sense to try to compare with other careers and other institutions of higher education as best we could, and try to figure out what are normal baseline pay for the different types of work that happens. And so if you're going to do that kind of research, you're going to be looking at the Bureau of Labor Statistics website and pulling out, they have it broken down by job title / zip code, right? So you can see our healthcare professionals in the La Crosse area paid more or less than is typical, and the answer is extremely less, but it's kind of a fun fact. So we're going to get our data from the Bureau of Labor Statistics. They collect this data, and actually it's very, very inexpensive to collect compared to some of the other data, for example, weather data is much more expensive than this. But anyway, there is a federal budget to collect this data, and then it's available for us to use. So the Consumer Price Index, the key with the Consumer Price Index is it's a basket of consumer goods and services paid by urban consumers. So it's not just, right, so the Big Mac example is just one product. The Consumer Price Index is deliberately a basket of lots of different things. And there's several different categories that fit within the CPI umbrella. But this is important, right, that the CPI will reflect the up and down of millions of individual prices, but it's meant to be a representative sample of what a consumer might buy. But this, of course, will not reflect exactly individual customers' experience. So if I think about my personal life, right, I have 5 children, and so we spend quite a bit more on food and diapers than is maybe typical for American families on average, right? So we're spending more on food. Not necessarily, actually. We're spending more on consumer staples, but less on like restaurant meals. I mean, it all sort of balances out, really. But the there's this basket of food that we spend. But I'm Mormon and therefore not a coffee drinker. So if there's a commodity spike in the price of coffee, that's going to show up in the CPI. But it won't affect my personal experience because I don't actually buy any of that. Right, and we don't drive a ton of miles. I mean, we of course drive some, but relative to other families, especially if you've got urban metropolitan families with 2 wage earners with long commutes, you're going to put a lot of miles on your cars, which means you'll be more sensitive to gas prices relative to our family. I live about 4 minutes from Viterbo, and so I do drive quite a bit back and forth, but it's hard to rack up miles when it only takes 4 minutes. And so that means I'm probably less sensitive to gas price. So again, that means that each individual consumer's experience with their basket, their personal basket, might be different than the broad experience. So we can say, oh, well, inflation has been fairly flat, almost less than 2%, closer to 0.5% for a long time. But that might not be true for an individual. So an individual might experience a ton of inflation or might experience deflation, in fact. I mean, if you're a huge soda pop consumer, you will have experienced deflation over the last 15 years. So pop has declined in price. Whereas things like textbooks have gotten extremely, extremely expensive very quickly. But to think about how we use the CPI to calculate inflation, we have this basket. We take basically the price of this basket of goods and create this index. So we have an index number based on these prices, and it changes over time. So the inflation rate for a year can then be measured by looking at this change in the consumer basket. And it's simply just a percentage change calculation. What were the prices this year? What were the prices last year? If they're 110 this year and 100 last year, that's a change of 10. 10 divided by 100 gets you 10%. That would be a 10% inflation rate. So really simple calculation. And that's indicative of what is the on average price change experienced by consumers in an economy. So what specifically are we sure to include in the CPI? Well, there's these 8 major categories: food and beverages, housing, apparel, transportation, medical care, recreation, education, and other goods and services. So we'll get into some details about what each of those things are. So food and beverage is that. I mean, it's important. Most important to understand, it includes groceries and consumer staples as well as restaurant meals. Right? So my McDonald's breakfast yesterday and my breakfast cereal lunch yesterday are both lumped in here. You can imagine that maybe restaurant meals might be down in recreation or something, but it's in food and beverages. So food, housing. This is basically rent of a typical house of a typical residence for a typical consumer. There's obviously a couple other things, but of course, housing is going. The house itself is going to be the primary driver of this expense. Apparel, so clothes. This is actually interesting. Apparel as a fraction of our basket of consumer expenditures has been declining over time. So if you go back to the 80s, we spent a bigger fraction of our income on apparel than we do now. So it's not necessarily clear what exactly is driving that. I mean, possibly it could tie into more casual work culture and also a flexibility of back in the 80s or before, right? You had a whole wardrobe for work and then a whole separate wardrobe for home or relaxing, and today we don't mingle as much. But also, the prices have come down. I mean, that's not really true. That they're higher than they were in the 80s, but relative to other goods, they've risen less. And so that means, and because wages have also risen, that means in effect the costs compared to wages have declined quite a bit. And so we're spending less of our money on apparel, but it's still in there. Transportation, so cars, gas, insurance, right, that kind of thing. Medical care, pretty straightforward. I mean, so drugs, medical supplies, and hospital services are all included. So that, right, there's physical and service aspects to medical care. Recreation has right, lots of durable things like computers and televisions and stuff. But of course, right, if you go to Disney World, it's going to be in there too. Here's our favorite, college tuition, and communication gets lumped in as well. So again, for many of us, that would be the major one would be a cell phone plan, right? So cell phone contract or purchasing phones. So those are together, and then the last kind of catch-all. So cigarettes, manicures, expenses. I mean, so lots of random things, but together compose, that final category. So that's, I mean, at some point it feels like everything's in there, so it's not. Taxes are not, and investments are not. So if I purchase, right, so if the stock market goes up, right, which it has recently. So in some sense, if the stock market goes up, that's like inflation for stocks. Right now I can't buy as many stocks as I could before with my money, but again, that it feels weird to think about that being inflation. Or we're trying to experience a typical consumer. If a typical consumer's investment portfolio increases in value, it doesn't come with the same hardship. It's in fact the opposite of hardship as an increase in groceries or gas. So it doesn't make sense to include it, and it's not. But so that includes stocks, but also life insurance and some other things. But the basic idea is to get investments out of the CPI and just focus on things that people actually consume. So that's where you get this collection of things, and then we track it over time and see what's happened. So now there's another number that's related to CPI. It's called the core CPI, and it gets talked about a lot because it's the same as CPI, but it excludes food and energy. Okay, so why? What's so special about food and energy? Well, food and energy are more than anything else in the CPI commodities, right? They're base, raw goods, but nevertheless still consumed by consumers, right? So, right, it definitely might be the case that, for example, sulfuric acid might move up and down a lot in price, that there's a commodity price for sulfuric acid, but that's not relevant to consumers, right? Sulfuric acid is used as an ingredient by chemical companies in producing other ingredients, which are then used to produce finished products, which are then used by retailers, which are then sold to market. So it's too many steps, and so in the sense that the commodity price swings for base industrial materials don't feed directly to consumers, whereas food and energy do. And so if pork spikes in price, since consumers buy pork directly and consume it, they would experience that commodity price spike. And so the end result of that is that including food and energy in the CPI, while appropriate, causes it to move up and down a lot. So you could say, well, we can still look at the long run average of CPI, and that's true, right? So we can look at the long run average of CPI and get a feel for how inflation is tracking over time. Or by excluding the volatile parts, you can get something close to CPI that doesn't move around as much and would be suggestive of what that average would be over time if food and energy were included. And so core CPI is often talked about for that reason. It's a way to get more timely updates on inflation rather than to wait for a long enough data series to average out volatile commodity prices. So that's the introduction to CPI. So in the next video, we'll talk about what the consumer price index has looked like in the United States over time, and what are some factors that cause it to rise and fall and affect our everyday experience.